Hey everybody, welcome to episode 65 of the AskDAP show, where we answer your Volkswagen and Audi questions. On this episode, we talk about piggyback modules with check engine lights. Should you upgrade or change your shocks at 50,000 miles? And broken coolant flanges.
Alex, via email, says, while trying to replace the cracked brake booster lines in my A3 with the FSI engine, I broke one of the vacuum nipples on the coolant flange. I was going to bypass this flange, but then I realized the hose sizes seem too tricky to match, so I'll just replace the entire flange. Since I'll be breaking the seal on the coolant system, will I need to flush the coolant after?
All right, so what he's referring to on FSI engines, the coolant flange, which is a housing on the driver's side of the cylinder head, it has two different parts of it. It actually bolts onto the cylinder head itself, and then has coolant hoses that run to it. That it has kind of almost like what looks like two fittings on the side that come out that are barbed that the coolant hoses slide onto. Directly below that, I believe it's directly below that, are the same thing, but it actually where vacuum runs through that. I'm not sure exactly why they designed it that way, but there is a hose that often breaks, which we actually have a DIY video on. I'll link to the hose that I'm talking about here, where you can check out that particular thing. There's also a link to the video which shows you replacing that. But basically what happens is as people are trying to slide that hose on, because they age and get brittle, the plastic will actually crack and you'll end up with a massive vacuum leak, and your power brakes won't obviously work very well when you have a massive vacuum leak to the brake booster, which obviously the vacuum is assisting the brake booster. Yeah, I mean, it seems like bypassing is probably an option. Like you probably found out, it's a lot more challenging to try to just bypass it than it is to probably just replace it with the correct part. Coolant flanges are not super expensive, so you know that would be a pretty decent and simple replacement when you're doing a job like that. I'll link to the coolant flange for FSIs here, where you can take a look and see kind of what the picture looks like with those two different nipples on the top and bottom for vacuum and for coolant. In regards to flushing the system, I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, most times when you're draining it, you're going to drain out a pretty good amount of coolant. You're going to lose a lot of coolant than doing it. It's not a bad idea if you're asking, since you have the system open and coolant's going to be coming out anyway, should you drain it all the way or get as much of the coolant out as possible? I would probably say yes. If you're going to be doing it, you might as well get all old coolant out and get all fresh coolant in. That's a pretty simple process, obviously, to just drain it all out. The one thing, obviously, I'm not sure how familiar you are with opening cooling systems or whatever, you do have to make sure you get air out of the system, because if you don't burp the cooling system, or what's called burping the cooling system, which means getting all the air out, you could end up with an overheating issue due to air pockets stuck in different parts of the engine, preventing the coolant to properly flow. So that's really the only thing you do need to do when you're doing something like this, is make sure that you burp the cooling system once you're done getting all the coolant back in the car.
ED Orlando via shopdap.com says, well, the P2015 fault codes continue. My husband's car, 2015 GTI, is now in the same issue. They won't replace, and he's at 40,000 miles, even though the car is only a year old. Any suggestions?
Okay, so this question was actually asked on an article that I wrote a long time ago talking about common problems on TSIs. That was talking about intake manifold failures. They are a pretty common failure part on those TSI engines. And basically what happens is the intake flap motor has issues. It's not serviceable separate from the intake manifolds. You have to replace the whole manifold. I reached out to a couple people I know about this, because obviously us not being a dealer, I don't have direct access or knowledge to what's actually failing live on current cars. A few different texts just to get kind of a broad overview. One of them being Charles, the home mechanic. I just shot him a message just to say, hey, you know, what have you seen on this? The general consensus I'm getting is that this is something that has been seen before with the P2015 faults on Mark 7s, as well as I think 1.8Ts. So that would be 2-liter turbo, and then the new 1.8T engines. They've seen this on. There are two separate components. There's the whole manifold with the sensor, And then there's just the sensor, which is basically a sensor that determines the position. It's an intake manifold position sensor that's also serviceable separate. So Charles said that he has seen more of the sensors fail. I've gotten kind of a little bit of a mix from other techs I've talked to saying that they've had to replace full manifolds, which includes the sensor, or just the sensors separately as well. So that would be something that obviously would require more diagnostic. But if you need a manifold, two things. One, I'll put a link to both the manifold and the sensor in the description below where you can check out the ones that for Mark 7s. But your other option is, because you're kind of near that window of you pass 36,000 miles, you can always call customer care and ask them if they can do anything for you. That would be an option. I'll try to find customer care's phone number, and I'll put that in the description as well, where you can check that out. But contacting them, let them know what happened. They should be able to at least lead you down the path of if there's something that can be done. My guess is usually in those scenarios they'll do like partial coverage, where they'll pay for the labor if you pay for the parts, or something to that effect. You know, depending on your scenario, the manifold in that car is probably not super tough. So depending, you may want to do the DIY yourself. Again, we can save you money on the manifold. So if you had to pay for it yourself, for sure we can help you out. But if you can get it covered in warranty, that would be a better scenario. So in regards to how prevalent this is versus TSI, you know, that remains to be seen. These cars are still pretty new, but obviously there have been a couple failures that people we are familiar with have heard of. So it's not uncommon, but it still remains to be seen how common this situation actually will be.
Chris Gale via email says, I currently have around 40,000 miles on my 2013 GTI with DSG. I'm going to install some VWR Springs early next year once the snow melts. By then I should have around 50,000 miles on the GTI. I know the VWR Springs are designed to work with the OEM shock, but I contacted my local shop and labor cost to install new springs is the same to install new springs and shocks. I'm thinking I'll just bite the bullet now and have them install new shocks as well, even though my OEM shocks have a lot of life left. What shocks should I buy? New OEM or something else? P.S. Ride comfort is very important to me. I'm 35 and the GTI is my DD. I want it to ride as close to stock as possible or better.
Okay, Chris, so you have a Mark 6, you are planning to do springs on it, and you want to potentially do shocks. Here's a couple things. Generally, most people in these circumstances, when they're asking what shocks should I do, they're planning on upgrading their shocks to performance shocks, because the reason why they're doing springs, they want to get kind of a kit to get better handling out of the car. And if you're nodding your head saying, yes, I agree with that, that's what I'm looking for too, it's probably not really what you're looking for, because keep in mind, anytime you have a car that you're modifying, you're trying to balance between comfort and performance. And those two things are generally pulling at opposite directions, where one side is comfort, the other side is performance. And for every person, where you fall in this spectrum is going to vary. So everybody's going to have to make their own decision on these things. So my thoughts are, based on what you're describing, is I would not invest the money into different suspension, especially because it's a fairly low mileage vehicle. If you really wanted to get new shocks, VW and Audi shocks generally last a while. They don't have severe issues with dying quickly. And since that's true, I don't recommend replacing shocks. You know, in my time at the dealer, you get a lot of these small shops who call up and try to price out things to customers to try to sell them to them. And that would be one thing that was common: shocks all the way around the vehicle, which, you know, you can, if you want to buy parts, I'm glad to help you with them, but I generally do not recommend replacing shocks all the way around the car unless there's some circumstance that makes you feel like you need them. And this would probably not be one of them. Yes, it is going to be expensive for labor if you were to have one go bad, but most likely if you were to have one go bad, it's probably in the maybe 80, 90, 100, 120,000 mile range, which obviously is way down the road for you. So the one thing I will say is, if you're doing springs and comfort is important to you and all that stuff, you will want to replace all the bushings and the strut bushings and bearings, as well as the bolts. This will prevent noises and creaking and just overall comfort, because strut bushings and bearings are something that some people don't think of when they're doing installs like this, and sometimes people don't do them to shave cost. And what ends up happening is, 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 miles later, you get this knocking noise when you turn at slow speeds because the strut bearings are worn out, and then you have to go through and spend all that money again. So that would be my advice. Get the springs, get a good installation kit with quality bushings and bearings, and generally would be the bolts in that circumstance as well. And that would probably leave you with a stock feeling suspension that's, still going to perform the way you want it to.
Garen via email says, I have a 2015 GTI with a Neuspeed power module and an APR carbon fiber intake. It has been running great for a while, but lately it's been giving me some issues. Occasionally when I use full throttle, the EP seat light will come on and the car will go into limp mode. I pulled the codes using my OBD11, thanks DAP, and consistently found the following codes.
Okay, Garen, so you're having issues around fault codes and you have a power module. So for anybody who's not familiar with what he's referring to, he has a Neuspeed power module, much like any other piggyback. Basically, all it does is plug in between the car and then the sensor, and basically it interrupts the signal between the two and tricks the vehicle into making more power. Essentially, that's how they work. A lot of them are going to vary a little bit. Some of them are a little more advanced than others, but essentially that's the basic overview of how they function. The issue you're having is basically, it's hard for me to answer that specifically, but here's what would happen if anybody would want to be diagnosing an issue like that. The number one thing you're always going to do is take the power module out of the car, remove it from the vehicle, try to duplicate the same circumstances that you're currently experiencing those situations under, and do it as many times as you possibly can to try to recreate it. If it doesn't come back, it's a pretty safe bet that something related to that is being causing your issue. Now specifically, I know he had mentioned that he reached out to Neuspeed and I'm not sure specifically, didn't get much feedback from them as far as they couldn't help him much, or if he just didn't hear back from them much in general. I'm not sure. We don't sell Neuspeed power modules, so I don't really know, but I would suggest taking it out, try to duplicate it. If it comes back, then something else is going on. And I'll say this, I've heard a lot of people who have piggyback modules because they plug it in a bunch of times or they take it in and out a bunch of times, that they end up damaging connectors or potentially pulling out wires and stuff like that. If that's the case, you should inspect that stuff too to make sure you have good continuity and that there are no wires that are pulled out or connectors that are broken that aren't latching properly, all that type of stuff. That's always going to be the first way to go with this situation, because whenever you have faults that are related to something that you could have done to modify it, you should always first assume it's that, instead of assuming it's something else or that something's wrong with the car. And so that's why going down the road of remove it, check it, hopefully it doesn't come back, and then you can pinpoint that. And if it does come back, then you have something else going on, at which point, again, go down the road of looking at the connectors first before you do that. And then obviously if it still continues after all that stuff's reset, then you can always take it to the dealer and try to see if they can diagnose your issue, because then you would have pinned down that it's not related to any of the modifications. So that's the road to go down. And again, thank you so much for the purchase of the OBD11. I appreciate the support very much.
Trey via email says, one question I have is that when adding a tune in a new intake and exhaust to increase horsepower and torque significantly, are there any other parts of the engine/entire car that I should upgrade in order for it to handle the stress this extra power is adding, or are the stock parts sufficient? Thanks for the help.
Okay, Trey, so I'm not sure specifically what kind of car you have, but in general, most cars with just those basic add-ons, which would be software, intake, downpipe, even when you add like intercooler and stuff like that, the factory parts generally are going to hold up okay. The one thing I would say that's going to be a questionable variable that may or may not would be the clutch. That is something that people do oftentimes kill earlier. Again, our car, stage 2, 26,000 miles, stock clutch still. So that's going to vary depending on driving style. If you have a DSG, there's not much you can do with the transmission to upgrade it. You know, there are some upgraded clutch packs and stuff like that, but you know, you're talking about spending a lot more money and more significant for high horsepower situations. So that's less of an issue there. You know, I mean, the one thing I think people oftentimes neglect would be things like brakes, because stopping, when you make a lot more power, stopping better is kind of important. And, you know, a lot of people kind of think like, oh, big brake kit, and that's the one people automatically gravitate towards, which creates kind of this sticker shock situation, because big brake kits are, you know, $2,500, $3,000. And you don't need to go that crazy. You know, the stuff we have on my car, that the EBC red stuff and the StopTech slotted stuff is super nice, drives great. I'm super happy with it. The stopping is significantly better than what you would get from the factory stuff. So, you know, that's kind of one thing that I would recommend potentially going with. Other than that, you know, things like the dog bone mount, again, we've talked about this, is varying levels of comfort for people. So that's a matter of opinion, but it will help you get less wheel hop and plant the front tires better when you're launching. So you're going to get better feel overall. So a lot of this stuff that people go down the road of modding is more complementary towards modifications than a necessity. Those type of things that intake, downpipe, tune pretty much stand alone by themselves. So you don't have to do anything else with it. It's just a matter of one preference, two driving style that are going to kind of determine the next mods you should take down on your list. So hopefully that answers your question and at least gets you kind of where you need to be. I know that's not the definitive answer you're looking for, that you need to do X or Y, but hopefully that gets you down the path to making a decision for yourself. Thank you so much for watching episode 65 of the AskDAP show. If you have any questions or comments about the questions answered in this show, be sure to leave in the comments below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.